A rusted steel trunk made a battle-trained German shepherd stop cold, and what he refused to walk away from had been hidden for decades. The metal lid slammed against the concrete with a sharp clang. Snow blew through the open storage unit as Earl dropped to one knee beside his German shepherd. Duke wasn't barking. He wasn't moving. His nose stayed pressed against a battered trunk buried beneath piles of ruined junk. Around them, people laughed and walked away. Then Duke let out a low growl Earl hadn't heard since overseas. And suddenly, the entire storage unit felt different. What do you think Duke sensed? The first thing Earl Whitman heard that night was the gravel. Not the wind coming down off the Bitterroot Range. Not the low groan of pine trees bending against the cold. Gravel. One tire rolling slow outside his pickup. His eyes opened before the sound finished. His right hand slid beneath the torn blanket, fingers closing around the old flashlight he kept under the seat. Duke lifted his head from the passenger footwell, ears sharp, body still as stone. Earl did not move fast. Fast got men killed. He listened. The truck outside passed without stopping, its taillights bleeding red through the frost-streaked glass. Only then did Earl breathe out through his nose. Duke watched him from the dark, amber eyes steady, waiting for the signal. "Clear," Earl whispered. The dog lowered his head again, but he did not sleep. Neither did Earl. The inside of the pickup smelled like wet wool, old coffee, and dog fur. A thin skin of ice had formed along the bottom edge of the windshield. Earl wiped a circle with his sleeve and looked out at the empty turnout, where he had parked just before midnight. Beyond the hood, the mountains were black shapes against a darker sky. Somewhere far below, the little town of Silver Pine slept under a few weak streetlights. Up here, there was only the road, the trees, and a man trying not to freeze before morning. Earl was 69 years old, though some mornings his knees argued for 80. His beard had gone mostly white. His hands were thick and scarred, the nails cracked from small jobs nobody else wanted. Splitting firewood, fixing fence wire, hauling scrap. Anything paid in cash and did not require too many questions. He had once worn a uniform every day. Army. Iraq first, Afghanistan later. Names of places that came back to him in pieces. Dust on his teeth. Diesel smoke. A radio voice breaking apart under static. A young soldier from Ohio laughing about pancakes 10 minutes before the road turned white. Earl did not talk about that. Talking made people shift in their chairs. Duke knew without asking. The German Shepherd had come to him 3 years earlier through a veterans outreach program that lost funding before Christmas. Duke had been a military working dog once, black and tan, broad-chested, trained to smell what men tried to hide. Powder, wire, metal, fear. At 7, he carried gray around his muzzle and a limp in his left rear leg when the weather turned cold. Still, he watched everything. Earl trusted him more than he trusted mirrors. A sharp crack split the night. Earl dropped flat across the bench seat before he knew he had moved. His shoulder struck the steering wheel. The flashlight clattered to the floor. Duke was up at once, not barking, just pressing his whole body across Earl's chest, heavy and warm. Another crack came, then a small burst of color above the far ridge. Fireworks. Somebody down in the valley celebrating a birthday, a football win, maybe nothing at all. Earl's fingers were locked around the edge of the seat. His breath came shallow. In the glass, the reflection of the colored sparks looked too much like a flare hanging over a road outside Mosul. Duke pushed his nose under Earl's wrist and held there. Not pulling, not whining, just holding. Earl closed his eyes. "Here," he muttered. Duke leaned harder. "Idaho," Earl whispered. "Pick up. Cold night. No contact." The word sounded foolish in the cab, but his pulse began to slow. He sat up after a while, rubbing the heel of his hand over his face. His palm came away damp. Duke settled beside him, but kept one paw on Earl's boot, as if pinning him to the present. "Yeah," Earl said, voice rough. "I know." Morning came pale and mean. The cold had found every seam in the truck. Earl's back ached from sleeping folded around the gearshift. Duke stood carefully, stretched, and waited while Earl counted the money in the old tobacco tin he kept in the glove box. $11, 2 fives, 4 quarters, 3 dimes, a nickel. He counted it twice, though nothing changed the second time. At the gas station on the edge of town, Earl bought 1 black coffee for himself and a plain biscuit for Duke. He broke the biscuit in half, then broke his half again and gave Duke the bigger piece. The dog took it gently, not begging, not snatching. Old manners. Good training. The attendant behind the counter watched Earl wash his hands in the restroom sink but said nothing. Earl appreciated that. Pity spoken out loud always sounded like insult wearing clean shoes. Outside, the morning sun hit the windshield of the pickup and showed him everything wrong with it. The cracked glass, the rust above the wheel well, the rear tire going soft again. He stood there with the coffee burning his hand through the paper cup and saw the sign across the road. Silver Pine Storage and Salvage. A banner hung crooked on the chain-link fence. Storage raffle today. $10 ticket. Win a full unit. Earl stared at it. Duke followed his gaze. Behind the fence, orange roll-up doors stood in rows against the hillside. Men in work jackets were already gathering near the office, laughing, drinking coffee from foam cups, pointing at trucks and trailers. Earl looked down at the tobacco tin. $11. The smart thing would be gas, or canned food, or nothing at all, because sometimes keeping $1 meant the difference between choice and no choice. Duke bumped his hand with his nose. Earl looked at the dog. "What?" he said quietly. "You got a feeling?" Duke's ears tilted forward toward the storage lot. Earl took one last drink of coffee. It had gone bitter at the bottom. Then he crossed the road with Duke at his side, one hand in his coat pocket. Fingers closed around 10 of his last $11. Silver Pine Storage and Salvage sat against the slope like it had been pushed there by weather and left to rust. Rows of orange metal doors ran toward the pine trees, most of them faded by sun and scraped by years of careless trailers. A chain-link fence leaned along the front, patched in 2 places with bent cattle panels. Near the office, a propane heater glowed beside a folding table where people had gathered around donuts and paper cups. Earl stopped just inside the gate. He counted exits without meaning to. Main gate behind him, office door left. Narrow lane between units leading toward the back fence. One man standing too close to the heater with his hands hidden in his coat. 2 trucks backed up near the loading area. A flatbed trailer with fresh mud on the tires. Duke stood at his left knee, head level, eyes moving. "Easy," Earl murmured. The dog's ear flicked once. Nobody moved aside for Earl. They looked at Duke first, then the truck coat Earl wore, then the old boots with the cracked soles. That was the order most people noticed him in now. Dog. Clothes. Damage. A man near the table gave a short laugh into his coffee. "Well, I'll be. Even brought security." Another man, younger, broad through the shoulders and wearing a cap that said Treasure Mule, grinned at Duke. "That dog better be good at sniffing gold, old-timer." Earl did not answer. He had learned years ago that some men threw words like rocks just to see if anything still bled. The office door opened, and a woman in a fleece vest stepped out with a clipboard. Her hair was pulled tight under a knit cap, and her cheeks were red from the cold. "All right, folks. We'll draw in about 5 minutes. $10 a ticket. Cash only." Earl walked to the folding table. The woman looked up, saw his face, and softened in a way he disliked. "One ticket?" she asked. "One." He placed a $10 bill on the table. It was folded twice and warm from his pocket. She tore a red ticket from the roll and handed him the half with the number. Earl looked at it. He slipped it into his coat and stepped away. The man in the treasure mule cap leaned toward his friend, but made sure his voice carried. "Hope he wins a mattress. Looks like he could use one." The friend laughed. Duke turned his head slowly. Not enough to threaten. Just enough. The laughing stopped for half a breath. Earl touched 2 fingers to Duke's shoulder. The dog relaxed, but only a little. They waited near the edge of the group, where the asphalt cracked and weeds had pushed through. Earl could smell cold oil, wet cardboard, old leaves gathered against the fence. The sun was up now, but it had no warmth in it. It shone flat across the storage doors, making every padlock glint like a small, hard eye. The woman with the clipboard climbed onto a wooden pallet and raised a coffee can full of ticket stubs. "All right," she called. "Grand prize today is one unclaimed 10x10 storage unit, contents as is. Winner has 48 hours to clear it. After that, Silver Pine Storage resumes possession. No exceptions." "Which unit?" someone asked. "Unit 17. A few men exchanged looks. The man in the cap snorted. 17? That's the junk cave." Somebody behind Earl said, "Old military stuff and busted furniture. Been sitting since before COVID." "Still could be tools," another man said. "Could be mice," the cap man answered. "More likely mice." The woman shook the coffee can. Paper rattled inside like dry bones. Earl felt Duke press lightly against his leg. The sound of those tickets in the can did something to him. Too close to brass casings in a metal tray. Too close to 1,000 small things falling after something bigger broke. His fingers tightened around the seam of his coat. Duke leaned harder. Earl looked down. The dog did not look up. He only stayed there. Steady. The woman reached into the can. The crowd leaned in. "Number 083. For a moment, Earl thought he had misheard. Nobody moved. The woman read it again. 083. Earl took the ticket from his pocket and unfolded it slowly. The men nearest him looked first at the paper, then at his face. The cap man's mouth opened into a grin. "Well, there you go," he said. "The man wins himself a kingdom." Laughter spread through the little crowd, not loud enough to be called cruel by anyone who wanted to deny it, just enough to make Earl feel each set of eyes like a finger pressing into an old bruise. The woman with the clipboard came down from the pallet. "Sir? That's you?" Earl nodded once. "Congratulations." She handed him a key attached to a plastic tag. "Unit 17. Last row against the trees." 48 hours? Earl asked. "That's right." He looked toward the back of the property. "Anything I leave goes back to us." The man in the cap called out, "Don't worry. Dumpster's free." More laughter. Earl closed his hand around the key until the teeth bit into his palm. Duke gave a low sound, not quite a growl. "Leave it," Earl said softly. They walked down the lane between the units. The laughter thinned behind them, but did not disappear. Earl could still feel it following him, bouncing off the metal doors. Unit 17 sat at the far end, where the asphalt dipped and runoff had carried pine needles against the threshold. The orange door was dented in 2 places. The number had been painted over once, badly, leaving a ghost of the old digits beneath the new. Earl slid the key into the padlock. It resisted. He worked it carefully, not forcing, listening to the small grind of rust inside the lock. After a few tries, it turned. The padlock came free. Earl crouched, gripped the handle at the bottom of the roll-up door, and pulled. The door rose with a scream of metal. The smell hit first. Damp cardboard, mouse droppings, cold iron, something sour from years without air. Inside, Unit 17 was packed from wall to wall with the kind of things people saved when they could not admit a life was over. Broken chairs, old toolboxes with no tools, a stained couch cushion, plastic bins clouded from age, rusted shelving, torn duffel bags, a stack of warped plywood, boxes marked with black marker that had bled into unreadable smears. Near the front lay a cracked motorcycle helmet with no visor. Behind it, an old footlocker sat open and empty, eaten by rust. Earl stood in the doorway and said nothing. There was nothing here he could use, nothing he could carry, nothing worth the $10 he had just spent, except maybe a wool blanket if the mice had left any of it. The crowd had been right. That stung worse than the laughter. A pickup rolled slowly past the end of the row. The capman leaned out the window and gave the unit a theatrical look. "Careful in there," he called. "Might find the lost city of trash." The truck kept moving. Earl stared into the dark storage room. His jaw worked once. Duke stepped past him. "Duke!" The dog did not stop. He moved through the first narrow gap between boxes, nose low, paws careful over broken glass and damp paper. Earl reached for him, but Duke had already gone deeper, weaving around a collapsed shelf toward the back left corner. Then he froze. Not sat, not sniffed casually. Froze. His body went rigid from muzzle to tail, the way it had years ago at a culvert outside Kandahar, seconds before a young lieutenant almost stepped where he should not have. Earl's breath changed. "What is it?" he whispered. Duke stood before a steel trunk wedged behind a broken dresser. It was dented, dark with rust, half buried under a rotten tarp. Nothing about it looked valuable. Nothing about it looked different from the rest of the junk. But Duke did not look away. He raised one paw and placed it against the trunk. Then he looked back at Earl. Outside, the last of the laughter faded behind the storage rows. Inside Unit 17, Earl stepped carefully over the ruined boxes and moved toward the only thing his dog had chosen. The steel trunk sat low against the back wall, jammed between the broken dresser and a stack of boxes gone soft from old leaks. It was not large, maybe 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, military green once, though time had turned it the color of pond water. Rust freckled the corners. The lid had been dented near the hasp, like someone had struck it with the heel of a boot years ago and failed to open it. Duke kept one paw on it. Earl stopped 3 feet away. Back. Duke obeyed, but only halfway. He moved his paw off the lid and sat beside the trunk, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the metal. Earl crouched slowly. His knees popped in the cold. He placed one hand against the floor to steady himself and looked for wires, seams, anything that did not belong. Habit. Useless here, maybe, but habits were just memories that learned how to move. No pressure plate, no trip line, no fresh disturbance, only dust. Still, his mouth had gone dry. The trunk smelled different from the rest of the unit. Under the mildew and cardboard rot, there was another scent. Old oil, canvas, metal kept sealed too long. Duke leaned forward and sniffed the hasp, then sneezed once. Earl almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I don't like it either." Behind him, footsteps crunched near the doorway. "You need help hauling that junk out?" It was the woman from the office. The clipboard was tucked under one arm now, and a set of keys hung from her belt. Up close, Earl could see her name stitched on her vest. Tanya. She stood at the threshold, but did not step inside. Earl looked back. "I'm all right." "You sure? We've got a dumpster out front. Anything you don't want, we can toss it." Saves you the trouble. Duke made a low sound in his throat. Tanya's eyes dropped to him. She did not laugh this time. Easy, boy. Earl rose slowly. He doesn't like strangers touching his work. His work? Old habits. She looked around the unit, then at the trunk. That thing? I can have Carl drag it out with the dolly. As if summoned by his name, a young employee in a brown jacket came around the corner pushing a hand truck. He was chewing gum and had music leaking from one earbud. This the one? He asked. Tanya nodded toward the trunk. Customer might want it. Carl stepped inside before Earl could answer. Duke moved. Not fast enough to be an attack. Fast enough to stop the room. He placed himself between Carl and the trunk, head low, teeth not showing, but his whole body saying no in a language even fools understood. Carl froze. Whoa. Earl's voice stayed quiet. Step back. I wasn't doing nothing. Step back. Carl did. One careful step, then another, until he was outside the door again. Duke did not relax. Tanya lifted both hands a little. Okay. Okay. Nobody's touching it. Earl looked at Duke, then the trunk. The last time Duke had stood like that, a boy from Nebraska had been laughing about beef jerky and walking toward a concrete culvert at the edge of a dry road. Duke had locked up, same posture, same low warning. Earl had pulled the boy back by his vest just before the engineer found the wire under the sand. The memory flashed and vanished. Hot wind, white sky, the bitter taste of dust. Earl blinked hard. Unit 17 returned around him. Cold floor. Orange door. Tanya watching. I'll handle it, he said. Tanya studied him. For a second it looked like she might ask something human. Then she decided not to. 48 hours, she said again, softer this time. I heard. She and Carl walked away. Earl waited until their footsteps were gone. Then he turned back to the trunk. You better be right, he told Duke. Duke sat down and thumped his tail once against the concrete. The hasp had rusted shut, but the lock was missing. Earl pulled the old bone-handled pocket knife from his coat, the one he had bought years ago at a truck stop in Missoula, and worked the blade into the seam. Rust flaked under the pressure. The blade slipped once and nicked his thumb. A red bead appeared. Duke's nose twitched toward it. Mind your business. The dog gave him a look that almost felt old enough to be judgment. Earl wiped the blood on his jeans and tried again. This time the hasp shifted. He slid the knife deeper, leaned his weight into it, and heard a small crack of corrosion giving up. The latch opened. For several seconds, Earl did not lift the lid. The unit seemed to hold its breath. Then he hooked his fingers under the edge and raised it. Inside, the trunk was lined with black oilcloth. Not random, not thrown together. Packed. The top layer held several round metal film cans, each wrapped in paper and labeled in faded pencil. Beneath those were small cassette tapes in cracked plastic cases, a bundle of black and white photographs tied with parachute cord, 2 notebooks wrapped in waxed canvas. A tarnished silver insignia lay in the corner, dark with age but still recognizable as military. Earl lifted one film can. The label read, Nineveh Province, March 2004. His hand went still. He picked up another. Convoy 6, Dust Storm, no report filed. A third, LZ Sparrow, civilians. The letters had been written by someone with a steady hand. Not hurried, not careless. Duke leaned close, sniffing the inside of the trunk with short, careful breaths. Earl set the cans back and lifted the photographs. The first showed a group of soldiers kneeling beside a mud wall, faces half covered in dust, rifles pointed down, not up. Behind them stood women and children wrapped in blankets. The second showed a field hospital tent at night, lit from within so that the canvas glowed like a lantern. The third showed a man in uniform holding a little girl against his chest while smoke rose behind him. Earl stared at that one longer than the others, not because he knew the man, because he knew the posture, the way a soldier carried someone fragile while still listening for fire. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same pencil hand, were 3 words. She was breathing. Earl swallowed once. At the bottom of the trunk, beneath the notebooks, something glinted. He reached down and pulled out the insignia. It was heavier than it looked. Silver dulled nearly black. Not a common pin. Not cheap. On the inside rim, tiny letters had been scratched into the metal. R.H. Earl looked at the lid. There, almost hidden beneath a strip of rust and old tape, were the same letters carved shallow into the steel. R.H. below them, another line. Keep until found. Earl read it twice. Outside, someone started a truck. The engine turned over with a hard metallic bark. Duke flinched toward the doorway, then back toward Earl. Earl closed the trunk halfway, not enough to hide it, only enough to feel the weight of it in his hand. He had come for a blanket, maybe a tool, maybe one small thing worth selling for gas. Instead, in a storage unit everyone had laughed at, his dog had found a locked piece of somebody's war. Earl looked at Duke. The dog's amber eyes did not move from the trunk. "What did you drag me into, boy?" Earl whispered. Duke pressed his nose once against the carved letters. R.H. Keep until found. And for the first time that morning, Earl knew with the cold certainty of a man who had survived too many quiet roads that this was not junk. This was waiting. He did not open another can in the storage unit. Some things punished curiosity when a man got careless. Earl closed the steel trunk, latched the rusted hasp, and looked at the narrow path between the ruined boxes and the daylight outside. The trunk was heavy enough that moving it alone would hurt. He moved it anyway. Duke backed out first, watching the lane. Earl bent at the knees, slid both hands beneath the trunk, and lifted. Pain sparked across his lower back. He held still, breathed through his nose, then took 3 steps. Set it down. 3 more. Set it down again. By the time he reached the pickup, his shirt clung cold against his spine. The man in the treasure mule cap watched from near the office, chewing a donut. "Find the treasure, did you?" Earl shoved the trunk into the truck bed and pulled an old tarp over it. "Blankets," he said. The man laughed. "That figures." Duke stood between Earl and the man until the laughter faded. Earl tied the tarp down with 2 lengths of rope, using knots his fingers still remembered better than names. Then he drove out of Silver Pine storage with $1 left in his pocket and a trunk full of things he did not understand. He did not go far. The first rule when carrying something that mattered was not to take the straight road. Earl drove through town once, slow, past the diner, past the feed store, past the library, with frost still clinging to its stone steps. He checked the mirror at every turn. A white Dodge followed for 2 blocks, then turned toward the lumberyard. A blue Subaru stayed behind him longer, but it belonged to a woman with 2 kids in the back and a grocery sack tipping over in the passenger seat. Clear. He parked behind an abandoned laundromat and opened the trunk again. The film cans lay exactly where he had left them, wrapped tight, dry inside their old metal shells. He picked the one labeled L.Z. Sparrow, Civilians, and held it in his palm. It was strange how little a thing could weigh when it was able to drag a man backward 20 years. Duke whined once. "I know," Earl said. He needed someone who understood old film. There was only one place in Silver Pine that might. Row Photo and Film sat 3 blocks off Main Street in a narrow brick building squeezed between a closed barber shop and a tax office. The sign above the door had faded from blue to gray. In the window sat old cameras, cracked leather cases, yellow envelopes, and a handwritten card that read, "We still develop film. Yes, really." Earl stood outside longer than he meant to. Duke waited beside him. Inside, a bell rang when the door opened. The shop smelled of dust, paper, and chemicals sharp enough to bite the back of the throat. Shelves climbed the walls, crowded with lenses, camera bodies, darkroom trays, old tripods, and boxes labeled in neat black marker. Behind the counter, a woman in her late 60s looked up from cleaning a strip of negatives. She had silver hair cut just below her jaw, a flannel shirt under a dark apron, and eyes that did not waste movement. "No passport photos," she said. "Machine's been dead since July." "I'm not here for that." Her gaze moved to Duke, then to Earl's boots, then to the film can in his hand. "You find that in a garage?" "Storage unit. That usually means mold." "Maybe." She held out her hand. "Let me see." Earl did not give it to her right away. The woman noticed. She lowered her hand, not offended. "My name's Maggie Rowe," she said. "This is my shop. If you want me to look at it, I'll look. If you want to stand there holding it like a grenade, that's your business." Earl almost left. Then Duke stepped forward and sat. Maggie looked down at him. "Well, he's got more manners than most men who come in here." Earl set the film can on the counter. Maggie picked it up carefully, reading the pencil label. Her expression did not change until she saw the small code written near the rim. Then her thumb stopped moving. "Where did you say you got this?" "Unit 17. Silver Pine Storage." "And there's more?" Earl said nothing. Maggie looked up. Something had sharpened in her face. "My husband was Marine Corps," she said. 22 years. I know what military labeling looks like when somebody doesn't want civilians reading it." Earl's jaw tightened. She turned the can once more. "This isn't vacation footage." "No." "How long was it in there?" "Years. Then if you want anything off it, we don't force it. We test. Slow." She took the can and led him through a black curtain into the back. The dark room was small and red-lit, the kind of red that made every surface look like it had been waiting under blood. Trays sat beside a sink. Clips hung from a line overhead. A film scanner hummed in the corner, old, but tended like a rifle kept clean. Duke hesitated at the curtain. "Let him in," Maggie said. "If he sheds, he sheds." Duke entered and settled near the door, facing outward. Maggie noticed that too. Good dog. He knows doors. Most survivors do. She did not look at Earl when she said it. For the next hour, Maggie worked mostly in silence. She cracked the can, removed the old reel, checked the edge for brittleness. Earl watched her hands. Steady hands. No wasted motion. That counted for something. At last, the first frames appeared on her monitor. Grainy, flickering. Color washed thin by age. A desert landing zone under a hard white sky. A helicopter lifting dust into a wall. Men running bent low beneath the rotor wash. A child wrapped in a blanket. A soldier waving people toward a marked zone with one arm while holding his rifle down in the other. Maggie leaned closer. Earl stopped breathing. The next frame jumped. A road. A convoy. Smoke. A Humvee burned at an angle in a ditch. Men moved through the haze with the tight, clipped urgency of people who had already accepted that panic would kill them faster. A soldier appeared in the frame, carrying a little girl against his chest, her face pressed into his vest. The red light above Earl flickered. Once. Twice. Somewhere in the dark room, the scanner clicked in a steady rhythm. Click, click, click. The sound slid under Earl's skin and became something else. Radio static. Boots on gravel. A voice shouting. Contact left. Earl dropped behind the work table before Maggie could turn. His shoulder hit a shelf. A box of photo paper slid to the floor. His hand went to his hip for a sidearm that had not been there in years. Duke moved instantly. He did not bark. He placed himself between Earl and the room, chest forward, head low, guarding the space while Earl stared at the floorboards like they might open under him. Maggie froze with one hand still on the scanner. No pity crossed her face. That mattered. She reached slowly to the wall and switched off the overhead red light. The room dimmed. Only the monitor remained, soft and blue. Earl, she said, though he had not given her his name. He looked up. She had read it from the faded VA card, tucked behind the cash in his wallet when he paid. No. He had not paid. He had not even shown it. Then he remembered. Duke's tag. She had looked at Duke's tag. "RO's clear," Maggie said quietly. Earl blinked. She repeated it, steady. "AO's clear." Duke turned his head and touched Earl's wrist with his nose. The floor came back. The darkroom came back. Maggie Rowe stood by the scanner with one hand open at her side, giving him time to decide whether the world was safe. Earl pushed himself upright slowly. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be." The monitor flickered again. On screen, the soldier with the child turned toward the camera for half a second. His face was dusty, tired, young enough to still believe time was generous. Maggie stared at him. Then she reached for a magnifier and leaned close to the image. "Mr. Whitman," she said softly. Earl did not correct her. She tapped the edge of the screen where the frame code had appeared. "You know what you're carrying?" Earl looked at the child in the soldier's arms. "No." Maggie's voice lowered until it barely moved the air. "This isn't family film. This is field evidence." Earl stood beside the scanner and looked at the frozen frame on the monitor. Dust hung in the image like smoke trapped under glass. The soldier carrying the child had his face half turned toward the camera. One eye narrowed against the sun, mouth open as if calling an order nobody in the room could hear. Maggie tapped the keyboard. The film moved again. A line of civilians crossed open ground with their hands raised. Two soldiers waved them toward a dry irrigation ditch that had been marked with orange panels. Somewhere beyond the edge of the frame, something hit the dirt hard enough to shake the camera. The image jumped. The man filming did not run. He steadied the shot, caught the tail of a helicopter dropping low, then turned toward a medic kneeling over a wounded boy. Earl's fingers curled around the back of a chair. Duke pressed against his leg. Maggie paused the footage. Whoever shot this was not some tourist with a camera. No. He knew where to stand. Earl looked at the angle of the frame. Low wall to the left. Burned vehicle to the right. Open lane across the middle. Too exposed for a man without training. Too calm for a man who did not understand what he was seeing. "He stayed out of the fatal funnel," Earl said. Maggie glanced at him. Earl did not explain. She rewound several frames and enlarged a corner of the image. A patch appeared on the shoulder of the soldier with the child. Faded by dust, but readable enough. Holloway. Maggie went still. "There's our R.H. Earl," said the name under his breath. "Robert Holloway. You know him?" "No." But the name landed wrong. Not familiar. Heavy. Maggie pulled one of the notebooks from the trunk and opened it on the counter. The pages smelled faintly of wax and dust. The handwriting was tight, slanted, disciplined. March 18th, 2004. Nineveh Province. LZ Sparrow. Official report will say no civilian presence in the AO. Film says otherwise. Maggie read the line twice. Earl reached for the notebook, then stopped with his hand above it. May I? She slid it to him. He turned the pages carefully. There were dates, coordinates, unit nicknames, weather notes, fuel counts, names of wounded men, names of families, small sketches of road networks and irrigation ditches. One page showed a rough map marked with a convoy route, a dry creek bed, and a square labeled schoolhouse. Earl's thumb stopped on that page. The room narrowed. Not from panic this time, from recognition. He leaned closer. Maggie watched him. What is it? Earl touched the penciled road with one finger. That bend. You know it? I drove through there. When? Long time ago. The answer came too fast and too flat, and Maggie did not push. Earl looked at the map again. The schoolhouse. The bend. The ditch where dust collected in pale drifts. He remembered a boy selling warm bottled water from a crate. Remembered a goat standing on the roof of a burned-out sedan. Remembered a staff sergeant named Danny Ruiz telling everyone to keep spacing because quiet roads were liars. Ruiz. Earl closed the notebook. His hand had started to shake. Duke rose slightly, shoulder pressing hard into his knee. Maggie turned back to the scanner and loaded a new section of film. There are more cans like this? 20 maybe. More tapes, too. And all of them were in that trunk? Yes. She sat back, eyes on the footage. Then Captain Holloway spent years saving something somebody else wanted buried. The next reel was different. No firefight. No convoy. A small clinic made from cinder blocks. An American medic changing the dressing on a child's arm. A woman in a black scarf handing a soldier a tin cup of tea. A young private sitting on a sandbag wall, writing a letter with his helmet balanced on one knee. Holloway's camera moved like a man who knew the value of staying quiet. Maggie softened despite herself. He wasn't just documenting operations. No, Earl said. He was documenting people. The cassette tape came next. Maggie had an old player under the counter, the kind with square buttons and a speaker that hissed before it spoke. She slid in a tape labeled Sparrow, personal log. At first there was only static. Then a man's voice. Rough, tired, southern edge under the military clipped tone. This is Captain Robert Holloway. If this is ever reviewed, start with the children. They'll try to make this about orders, maps, and who signed which paper. Don't let them. Start with the children. The tape clicked softly as it turned. Earl did not move. Holloway continued. Official report will say LZ Sparrow was clear before the convoy was redirected. That is false. We had civilians in the zone. We had prior notice. I sent it up twice. No response. When the dust came in, command lost the picture, and men on the ground paid for it. Maggie's face had gone pale. The voice dropped lower. If this ever gets out, they'll call it treason. But silence already killed better men. The tape hissed. Then a long pause. Then Holloway said, almost too softly to hear, Grace, if you ever hear my voice, know this much first. I did not forget you. Maggie's hand moved to stop the tape, but Earl caught her wrist gently before she touched the button. Let it run. The speaker hissed again. No more voice came. Only wind across a microphone, distant rotor blades, a man coughing. Then the tape clicked off. The dark room sat silent. Outside the shop, a logging truck rolled down Main Street, brakes groaning, chains clinking. Earl's shoulders tightened at the metallic sound, but Duke leaned into him before the past could get its teeth in. Maggie slowly removed the cassette. Grace. Earl stared at the player. Daughter, maybe. Or wife. No, Earl said. He did not know why he was sure. Not wife. Maggie looked toward the trunk beyond the curtain. You need to get this out of your truck. I don't have anywhere. You do for tonight. Earl shook his head. I'm not asking for charity. I didn't offer charity. Maggie stood. I offered dry storage. There's a difference. He almost argued. Then Duke stepped toward the curtain and looked back at him, as if the decision had already been made. Maggie pulled a ring of keys from her apron. Back room locks from the inside. There's a cot if you need it. Dog can stay. I have coffee, canned soup, and a temper, so don't mistake kindness for softness. Earl looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Together they carried the steel trunk into the back room of Row Photo and Film. Maggie cleared a space beneath a shelf of old enlargers. Earl set the trunk down with care, then placed one hand on the lid. R.H. Keep until found. By evening, snow began to fall over Silver Pine, thin and slow, dusting the sidewalks and the hoods of parked trucks. In the back room, Duke lay beside the trunk, head on his paws, eyes open. Earl sat on the cot and unfolded Holloway's map again. He marked the A.O. with a stub of pencil. Then, beside the road bend he remembered, he wrote one name from a grave he had never stopped carrying. Ruiz. The letters sat there, under the dim lamp. A dead captain, a lost daughter, a buried report. And now one name Earl knew. Whatever Holloway had kept in that trunk, it was no longer only somebody else's war. By sunrise, Silver Pine looked smaller under the snow. Main Street had gone quiet, except for the scrape of a plow blade and the soft hiss of tires passing through slush. Earl woke before Maggie opened the shop, sitting upright on the cot, with his boots already on, and Duke's head resting across his ankle. He had slept maybe an hour. The kind of sleep that came in broken pieces. A face, a road, a radio call cut in half. Ruiz laughing with a cigarette tucked behind one ear, even though he never smoked. Then the red darkroom light flickering into a flare, and Duke pressing him back into the present with warm, stubborn weight. Maggie came through the back door carrying 2 coffees and a paper sack. You look like roadkill that got up and made bad decisions, she said. Earl took the coffee. Morning to you too. She set the sack on the workbench. Egg sandwiches. Don't argue. He did not. Duke watched the sack with professional interest. Maggie broke off a plain corner of biscuit and handed it to him. And you, Sergeant Nose, earned breakfast. Duke took it gently. For the next 3 hours, Maggie worked the reels while Earl sat beside the trunk and logged each label in an old receipt book. She had called one person before dawn, a retired museum archivist in Boise named Helen Park, and sent 3 still frames through a secure email Maggie said she still trusted more than most people. By 10:30, Helen called back. Maggie listened without speaking for nearly 2 full minutes. Earl watched her face tighten, then go still. When she hung up, she turned slowly. She says if the reels are authentic, this is historically significant. Earl looked down at the receipt book. That mean money? It means trouble first. Money later. How much trouble? Maggie folded her arms. Enough that Helen told me not to send another frame until we know who legally owns the material. Earl gave a dry laugh. I won it in a raffle. That may cover the physical trunk. It may not cover the rights to what's on the film. Sounds like lawyer talk. It is. Duke lifted his head before either of them heard the car. A low engine rolled into the alley behind the shop, smooth and expensive, not like the pickups that usually coughed through Silver Pine. Duke rose without a sound and moved between Earl and the back door. Maggie looked at the security monitor above the shelf. A black SUV sat outside, clean despite the snow, windows tinted dark enough to hold no reflection but the sky. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat, leather gloves, and polished shoes that had no business near Maggie's muddy back step. "Well," Maggie said, "trouble wears good wool." The bell rang in the front of the shop a moment later. Maggie went out first. Earl followed with Duke at his left side. The man stood near the counter, studying an old Leica in the display case without touching it. He was in his late 50s, tall, gray at the temples, handsome in the practiced way of men who had learned to make rooms feel like they belonged to them. When he smiled, it reached almost to his eyes. "Mrs. Rowe," he said. "Clayton Pierce." Maggie did not offer her hand. "Door says closed. I apologize for the intrusion. Helen Park is an old colleague. She thought I might be useful." Maggie's mouth tightened. Helen has a big mouth for a careful woman. Pierce turned to Earl. His gaze moved over the coat, the beard, the old boots, and came to rest on Duke. Unlike the men at the storage lot, he did not smirk. "Mr. Whitman," he said, "and this must be Duke." Earl did not answer. Pierce accepted the silence as if it had been expected. "I collect and preserve military archives, private letters, field footage, unit records. Things institutions lose, governments misplace, and families don't know how to protect." "Sounds noble," Maggie said. "It can be," Pierce replied. "It can also be expensive." He removed his gloves one finger at a time and placed them neatly on the counter. "I understand you came into possession of a trunk connected to Captain Robert Holloway." Earl's hand lowered to Duke's collar. Pierce noticed. "I'm not here to take anything." "No," Earl said. "You came to buy." The smile warmed slightly. "Direct." "I appreciate that." Maggie stepped behind the counter. "You haven't seen the collection." "I've seen enough to know what kind of storm is coming." Pierce looked at Earl again. "Storage companies have lawyers. Holloway may have heirs. Military records can be complicated. If there is evidence of misconduct, people will argue over access, chain of custody, intent, classification, authenticity. That kind of fight eats men alive." Earl said nothing. Pierce reached into his coat and removed a checkbook. Maggie gave a short laugh. "People still carry those? People who prefer not to waste time." He wrote quickly, tore the check free, and placed it on the glass counter. Earl did not look down at first. Then he did. $400,000. The number sat there in blue ink, calm as a loaded weapon. Outside, a truck rolled by, chains clanking over the wet street. Earl heard it dimly. $400,000. A room with heat, tires that held air, medicine for Duke's hip, a dentist, a bed, enough distance between him and the next cold night that he could stop counting coins in a tobacco tin. Duke leaned against his leg. Pierce saw the shift. Men like him always did. "That is for the physical archive," he said. "Today, you walk away clean. I handle preservation, legal review, publication, museum placement. Captain Holloway's legacy will be protected." "By you," Maggie said. "By someone with the means to protect it." Earl finally lifted his eyes. "What happens to Grace?" Pierce paused. It was small, barely there. But Earl had spent half his life watching men try not to react. "Grace?" Pierce asked. You heard me. Pierce's smile returned. Careful now. If there is a family member, she will be treated respectfully. That's not an answer. It is the only answer I can give without knowing who she is. Maggie watched him from behind the counter. But you knew the name. Pierce looked at her, then back at Earl. Captain Holloway mentioned many people in his materials, I'm sure. Duke growled. Not loud. Enough. Pierce's eyes dropped to the dog. Duke's lips had not pulled back. His ears were forward, body tight, gaze fixed on Pierce's right hand, where it rested too close to the counter edge beneath which Maggie had stored the sample reel. Earl touched Duke's collar. Leave it. Duke stopped growling, but he did not look away. Pierce slowly lifted both hands, palms open. The gesture was smooth, almost amused. Your dog has strong opinions. He reads rooms. And what does he think of this one? Earl looked at the check again. The blue ink did not tremble. His own hand did. He folded the check once and slid it back across the counter without taking it. Pierce did not pick it up. Mr. Whitman, he said softly, I don't think you understand what you're refusing. Earl looked toward the back room where the steel trunk sat under a shelf of old enlargers. No, he said. I don't think I understand enough yet. Pierce studied him for a long moment. The warmth drained from his face so slowly, most people would have missed it. Then he put his gloves back on. I'll leave my card, he said. Offers like this tend to get smaller once other people get involved. He placed a cream-colored card beside the check and walked to the door. At the threshold, he turned once more. Be careful with history, Mr. Whitman. People think it belongs to the truth. It usually belongs to whoever can afford the lawyers. The bell rang when he stepped out. The black SUV pulled away a minute later, tires whispering through the slush. Maggie waited until it was gone. You okay? Earl stared at the check still lying on the counter. Duke nudged his hand. Earl took the check, tore it cleanly in half, then into quarters and dropped the pieces in the trash can beneath the counter. His face did not change, but when he spoke, his voice came out low. He knew Grace. Maggie looked toward the back room. Duke was already moving that way, nose lifted, following a scent none of them could see. The storm had started, and now they knew it had money behind it. By closing time, Silver Pine had gone dark early. Snow kept falling, not hard, just steady enough to soften the edges of the town and turn the alley behind Row Photo and Film into a strip of gray slush. Maggie locked the front door, checked the back door twice, then pulled the old canvas shade down over the window. Earl watched her from the back room. You do that every night? He asked. Since my husband died, Maggie said. Before that, he did it. She said it without decoration, like a nail driven clean. The steel trunk sat beneath the shelf of enlargers. Maggie had wrapped the film cans in clean cloth and placed them inside a dry plastic bin, but Earl had insisted the bins stay in the trunk. He did not like pieces being separated before he understood the whole picture. Duke lay beside it, though his eyes had not closed in an hour. Maggie noticed. He knows something. He knows too much. She handed Earl a bowl of soup heated on a small hot plate. Eat. He took it, but did not sit right away. He walked to the rear window and lifted one corner of the shade with 2 fingers. The alley was empty. Beyond it, a line of pine trees bent under snow, black trunks fading into the hillside. The security light over the back step clicked and hummed. Its yellow circle left too much dark around the edges. Earl disliked light that told you where to stand. He turned it off. Maggie raised an eyebrow. I paid for that bulb. Light makes a target. She looked at him for a second, then reached behind the counter and killed the front display lights too. All right, she said. No targets. Earl finally ate, sitting on a wooden crate near the cot. Duke took a small piece of bread from his hand, then lifted his head toward the back door. Earl stopped chewing. Maggie froze with a spoon halfway to her mouth. At first, there was nothing. Then came the faintest sound, gravel shifting under a tire. Not on Main Street. Not out front. Behind the shop. Earl set the bowl down without a sound. Duke was already standing. Maggie whispered, "Could be a delivery." "At 9 at night?" She did not answer. Earl moved to the wall beside the window, not in front of it. He lifted the shade a fraction and angled a small round mirror from Maggie's camera repair kit into the gap. The alley appeared backward in the glass. A truck sat beyond the pines. Dark, no headlights, engine off, no plates on the front. 2 doors opened. 2 men stepped out. They wore dark jackets and gloves. One carried a pry bar low against his leg. The other had a small flashlight cupped in his palm, the beam covered red. Earl let the shade drop. Maggie's face had gone tight. "Pierce? Maybe. Maybe not. What do we do?" Earl pointed to the front room. "You go behind the counter. Stay low, phone in hand. Don't call yet unless I tell you." "Why not now?" "Because if they hear sirens early, they run. If they're just thieves, they run. If they're not, I want to know what they came for." Maggie stared at him. Then she nodded once and moved. Earl looked at Duke and gave 2 fingers downward. Duke lowered into a crouch. "No bark," Earl whispered. Duke's tail went still. The back doorknob turned once. Slow. Then pressure came against the frame. The old wood gave a quiet complaint. Metal scraped at the lock. Earl moved along the inside wall, staying out of the rectangle of pale window light. His body knew the shape of this without thinking. Cover. Angle. Distance. Do not meet force at the door. Let it enter where you can see it. The lock snapped with a small crack. The door opened 6 inches. A gloved hand slid in. Then the man with the pry bar stepped through. Duke hit him low. Not wild, not frantic. Trained. He came from the shadow beside the shelves and clamped onto the man's forearm before the pry bar lifted. The man cried out and slammed backward into the door. The flashlight dropped and rolled across the floor, throwing a red beam over the walls like a warning flare. The second man pushed in fast. Earl caught his wrist, turned with him, and drove him shoulder first into the shelving unit. Old camera boxes crashed to the floor. The man swung blind. Earl ducked under it, shoved him hard into the workbench, and pinned his hand flat with a forearm. "Clear out," Earl growled. The man with the pry bar kicked. His boot caught Duke in the ribs. The sound Duke made was not loud. That made it worse. The dog released and stumbled sideways, legs scrambling on the concrete. The man ripped free, clutching his bleeding sleeve, and ran out the back door. The second man twisted from Earl's grip and followed, knocking over a stack of trays as he went. Earl moved to the doorway, but did not chase into the dark. Chasing into unknown ground was how men with families got folded flags. He watched the 2 shadows reach the truck. The engine roared. The truck fishtailed in the snow and vanished down the service road without lights. Only then did Maggie come from the front, phone in hand, voice shaking for the first time since Earl had met her. "Duke." Earl was already on his knees. Duke lay beside the workbench, breathing fast. His ears were up, but his body had curled slightly around his left side. "Hey," Earl said, and the word broke rough in his throat. "Hey, soldier. Look at me." Duke's eyes found him. Earl ran both hands along the dog's ribs, gentle but firm. No open wound, no broken skin, tender along the side. Maybe cracked rib, maybe bruised bad. Duke flinched once, then licked Earl's wrist as if apologizing for it. "Don't you do that," Earl whispered. "Don't you apologize to me." Maggie crouched beside them with a towel. "There's a vet outside town. I know her. I'll call." Earl nodded, still holding Duke's head against his knee. Across the room, the steel trunk sat exactly where it had been. The red flashlight beam, still glowing on the floor, pointed straight at it. Maggie followed Earl's gaze. "They weren't here for cash," she said. "No." Outside, snow blew through the broken back door and melted on the concrete. Duke tried to stand. Earl held him down with one hand. "Stay." For once, the dog resisted. Weakly, stubbornly, Duke dragged one paw across the floor toward the trunk. His claws scraped once against the steel. Then he lowered his head beside it, hurt but still guarding. Earl looked at the broken lock, the red flashlight, the trunk, and the dog who had taken a boot to the ribs rather than let strangers touch it. His voice came out flat and quiet. "Now we know they're scared of what's inside." Maggie did not answer right away. The broken back door hung crooked in its frame, letting snow sweep into the shop in thin white ribbons. The red flashlight the intruders had dropped still glowed on the floor, its beam lying across the concrete like a wound. Duke breathed hard beside the steel trunk, his eyes open, his body curved around the pain in his ribs. Earl stayed on his knees. He had seen men try to keep standing after worse. Pride could carry a body past the point where sense had already given up. Duke was doing that now, trying to hold the line because the line was all he understood. "Easy," Earl whispered. Duke's tail moved once, barely. Maggie came back from the front room with a wool blanket, medical tape, and a small plastic bin of supplies. "Dr. Felton is on her way. She said don't move him too much unless his breathing changes." Earl nodded. He slid one hand under Duke's chest, feeling each breath. Fast, but steady. No wet sound. No blood at the mouth. That was something. Not enough, but something. Maggie crouched on the other side. "He saved us." Earl looked at the dog's gray muzzle, the scar along his back leg, the old strength still there under the hurt. "He's done that before." "Saved you?" Earl did not answer. Duke's paw scraped weakly against the trunk once, then again. Earl looked down. Not now. Duke lifted his head and pushed his nose against the bottom corner of the trunk. His ears folded slightly, not in fear. Insistence. Maggie saw it too. What's he doing? Same thing he did at the storage unit. Duke pawed the lower left corner again. His claws clicked against the steel, then slipped under a warped seam Earl had not noticed before. The trunk looked solid from above, but the bottom lip sat wrong, just a hair too high on one side. Earl's eyes narrowed. He ran his fingers along the corner. Rust had built up thick there, but beneath it, something shifted. Not the trunk itself, a panel. "Maggie," he said. She handed him the small work light without being asked. Earl tilted it low and saw the line. Not a crack, a cut. A narrow steel plate had been fitted beneath the trunk's interior floor, covered so carefully by grime and old oilcloth that no one would see it unless a wounded dog kept dragging himself toward it. Earl looked at Duke. The dog had lowered his head again, exhausted, but his eyes stayed on Earl's hands. "All right," Earl murmured. "I'm listening." He pulled the film cans and notebooks from the trunk one by one, placing each on Maggie's clean towel. Then he peeled back the old oilcloth lining. The hidden panel ran nearly the full width of the bottom. There was no handle, just a tiny notch near the left corner. Maggie handed him a flat screwdriver. Earl slid it into the notch and pressed. Nothing. He adjusted his angle. braced the trunk with one knee, and tried again. The panel gave with a soft, metallic pop. Maggie drew in a breath. Under the false bottom lay a shallow space, no deeper than a man's hand. Inside were objects wrapped in waxed canvas and tied with faded cord. Earl lifted the first bundle. It was a packet of letters, never mailed. Each envelope had the same name written on it: Grace Ann Holloway. The letters were dated across decades: 1978, 1983, 1991, 2004, 2017. Earl's thumb stopped on the oldest envelope. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the handwriting remained steady: "For my daughter, if I ever earn the right." Maggie's face changed. Not much. Enough. Earl set the letters down and lifted a second bundle. Inside was a small cassette tape sealed in plastic, marked "Final Log, Grace." Beneath it lay a folded birth certificate, brittle with age, and a black and white photograph of a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. On the back, written in Holloway's hand: Grace Ann, 4 days old. I held her for 9 minutes. That was all they allowed. The room went quiet except for Duke's breathing and the snow ticking against the broken door. Earl stared at the picture. 9 minutes. A man could live the rest of his life inside 9 minutes if that was all he had been given. Maggie touched the edge of the birth certificate. Mother's name is listed: Caroline May Holloway. Father? Robert James Holloway. Earl looked at the trunk lid where R.H. had been carved into the steel. Robert Holloway. Maggie unfolded another paper from the bottom. There's an address. Where? She read it slowly. Wind River County, Wyoming. Rural route. Looks old. Earl reached for the sealed cassette. Maggie hesitated. Are you sure? No. He took it anyway. The old tape player still sat on the bench from the night before. Maggie checked the cassette shell for cracks, then slid it in carefully. Her finger hovered over the button. Earl moved closer to Duke before she pressed play. Static filled the room. Then Holloway's voice came through, older now. Rougher. The voice of a man recording something he had rehearsed too many times and still could not say clean. Grace, my girl, if someone found this, then I failed again. Or maybe I finally did one thing right. The tape hissed. I was told you were better off without me. At 19, I believed people who wore suits and spoke like they were reading from law books. Later, when I came back with rank on my chest and money enough to find you, they told me I had signed away the right to come near. Maybe they were right. Maybe they weren't. But I watched from a distance when I could. School plays, county fair, your wedding from across the road. I never crossed that line. I told myself it was honor. Some days I think it was cowardice. Maggie looked away. Earl's hand rested on Duke's shoulder. Holloway continued. In Iraq, they ordered me to bury a report. Men died under bad orders. Families were lied to. I kept the film because film doesn't salute. Film doesn't get promoted. Film just keeps what happened. A long pause. Then the voice dropped. They made me useful, then disposable. Said if I pushed, they would bury me under charges and take whatever was left of my name. I could survive that. I could not survive them dragging you into it. Earl's jaw tightened. I put everything in the trunk. The film, the names, the proof, and the one truth I never had the courage to carry to your door. You were loved. Every day. Whether you knew it or not. The tape clicked. Then silence. No one moved. Duke shifted and gave a small, pained breath. Earl immediately bent closer. hand on the dog's neck. "I got you," he whispered. Maggie wiped at one eye with the heel of her hand, angry at herself for doing it. "If Grace is alive," she said, "this archive may belong to her." Earl looked at the letters, the photo, the birth certificate, the film cans lying in neat rows like sealed testimony. $400,000 had sat on the counter that morning. A room, heat, food, a doctor for Duke. He could still call Pierce, could still hand it over, could tell himself men like Holloway were dead, and dead men did not need justice as much as living men needed shelter. Duke's eyes opened. The dog looked at him, not judging, just seeing. Earl picked up the photograph of the baby and slid it gently back into the waxed canvas. "We find her," he said. Maggie nodded. "Wyoming is a long drive." Earl looked at Duke's bandaged side, the broken door, the snow-covered alley where the truck had vanished. "Then we leave before they come back." They were on the road before dawn. Maggie drove because Earl's pickup had one bad tire and a heater that worked only when the engine felt generous. Her old Subaru wagon rattled over the icy road out of Silver Pine with the steel trunk strapped down in the rear cargo space, wrapped in moving blankets and tied with rope Earl had knotted himself. Duke lay across the back seat, one side rising carefully with each breath. Dr. Felton had said nothing was broken, but bruised ribs on an old working dog were no small thing. Duke had been given medicine, a soft bandage, and strict instructions to rest. Duke ignored the last part. Every few miles, he lifted his head and looked toward the trunk. Earl sat in the passenger seat with Holloway's folded address in his hand. Wind River County, Wyoming. The road south and east opened into white country. Idaho's mountains fell behind them in long, dark ridges. Pine gave way to open ranch land, then high desert brushed with snow. Fence posts leaned under the weight of ice. Cattle stood in black clusters near hay rings, steam rising off their backs in the cold. Maggie drove with both hands on the wheel. "You think Pierce is following?" she asked. Earl checked the side mirror. A fuel tanker 2 vehicles back, a ranch truck farther behind. No black SUV. Not yet. "That's comforting." "No, it isn't." She gave him a brief sideways look, almost a smile, then watched the road again. They stopped once at a gas station outside Pocatello. Earl walked Duke in a slow circle near the edge of the lot, staying away from the idling semis. One driver dropped a metal tire iron onto the pavement. The clang cracked the morning. Earl's body turned before his mind did. Shoulders low, left foot back. Eyes scanning roofline, pumps, windows, exits. Duke leaned against his knee despite the pain. The truck driver glanced over. "Sorry, buddy." Earl nodded once and looked away. Maggie saw it from beside the pump, but said nothing. That was becoming one of the things he trusted about her. By late afternoon, they reached the turnoff near Wind River. The highway narrowed into a county road, then into a gravel lane that ran between frozen pasture and low hills patched with sagebrush. The sky had gone the color of old pewter. Far ahead, the Wind River Range rose blue and white, too big to be argued with. The address led to a ranch house set back from the road behind a line of cottonwoods. The house was pale green with a tin roof and a porch that sagged in the middle. A red barn stood beyond it, weathered and square against the wind. 3 horses watched from a fenced paddock, tails switching against the cold. As Maggie slowed near the mailbox, Earl touched her arm. "Stop here." She braked. "Why?" Earl looked at the house. One upstairs window, curtains open, smoke from chimney. Tire tracks in the snow, 2 sets old, 1 fresh. No dogs barking. No vehicles visible except an old white farm truck near the barn. "Let me look." He stepped out first, boots crunching in the packed snow. Duke tried to follow, but Earl raised one hand. "Stay." Duke's ears flattened, offended. "Doctor's orders." The dog huffed through his nose and stayed. Earl walked up the drive slowly, hands visible, body angled slightly so he did not look like a man coming straight at the house. Halfway to the porch, the front door opened. A woman stood there with a shotgun held low across her body. She was tall, maybe 67. Gray hair pulled into a braid over one shoulder. She wore a canvas coat, jeans tucked into mud boots, and work gloves dark from use. Her face was lined by wind and weather, not softness. She looked at Earl the way ranch women looked at things that might be a problem, without blinking. "That's far enough," she said. Earl stopped. Maggie stepped out of the Subaru but stayed by the driver's door. The woman's eyes flicked to her, then to the back seat where Duke was now sitting upright despite the bandage. "You folks lost?" "No, ma'am," Earl said. "I'm looking for Grace Holloway." "You found her?" The name shifted something in the cold air. Earl reached slowly into his coat, using 2 fingers. Grace raised the shotgun an inch. "Easy," he said. "Just a photograph." He pulled out the black and white picture of the baby and held it where she could see it from the porch. Grace did not move for several seconds. Then her mouth tightened. "Who are you?" "Earl Whitman, Army veteran. This is Maggie Rowe. We found something that belonged to Captain Robert Holloway. The shotgun stayed where it was. My father was no captain to me." Earl kept his hand steady. "He left your name on a tape." Grace gave a short, humorless laugh. "That man left plenty of things, I imagine. Just not a wife and daughter." Duke whined from the Subaru. Grace looked toward him. "He hurt?" "Bruised ribs," Earl said. "Took a kick last night." "Protecting you?" "Protecting what we brought." That landed. Grace looked from Duke to the photograph. Her gloves creaked around the shotgun. "You've got 5 minutes," she said. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and horse liniment. A cast-iron stove warmed one wall. A row of muddy boots stood by the door. On the table lay a half-mended bridle, a coil of baling twine, and a newspaper folded to the weather. Grace did not offer coffee. Earl did not expect any. Maggie carried in the small tape player and the envelope marked Grace Ann Holloway. Duke came in last, moving carefully, and lay down near Earl's chair with a quiet groan. Grace noticed. Whatever wall she had built around herself, the dog found the first crack in it. Earl placed the baby photograph on the table. Grace stood over it. Her face did not change, but one gloved hand came up and rested against the back of a chair. "My mother said he held me once," she said. Then he left. That was the whole story. Earl slid the oldest envelope across the table. "For my daughter, if I ever earn the right." Grace looked at the handwriting but did not touch it. Maggie pressed play. Static. Then Robert Holloway's voice filled the ranch kitchen, older and rougher than any photograph could show. "Grace, today you turned 6. I watched from across the road while you dropped your ice cream in the dirt and got mad enough to kick the fence post. You had your mother's temper. Maybe mine too. I wanted to walk over. I didn't. The papers said I had no right. Some days I obeyed because it was law. Some days because I was afraid you'd look at me and see a stranger." Grace's hand slid from the chair back. The tape clicked softly. "Grace, you were 12 today. You won a blue ribbon with a horse named Juniper. You looked so proud you almost forgot to hide it. I have carried that look through worse places than any child should know exist." Grace sat down, not slowly, as if her knees had simply stopped negotiating. Earl did not watch her face. He looked at the table, at the worn grain of the wood, giving her what privacy he could. The tape moved forward through years. A birthday, a graduation, a wedding seen from across a county road, a baby born, a husband buried, Grace fixing fence alone in rain, Grace laughing with a granddaughter near the barn. The last entry came after a long hiss. If you hate me, you have earned that right. If you never want my name near yours, I accept it. But do not let anyone tell you that you were unwanted. I have loved you from the edge of every room I was too ashamed to enter. The tape stopped. No one spoke. Outside, wind dragged loose snow against the kitchen wall. Grace stared at the player. The shotgun leaned forgotten beside the door. After a long time, she reached toward the baby photograph. Her hand stopped above it, trembled once, and then settled on the table beside it instead. There was a man, she whispered. Maggie looked up. Grace's eyes stayed fixed on nothing. At the county fair, years ago, I was maybe 16. He stood near the livestock pens with a camera hanging from his neck. I remember because he looked like he wanted to say something and couldn't. I thought he was just some lonely old vet watching kids ride horses. Her mouth twisted slightly. He bought a lemonade from my booth and left a $20 bill. I ran after him to give change back, but he was gone. Earl said quietly, "That was him." Grace closed her eyes. One tear slipped down, but she wiped it away with the heel of her palm, almost angry at it. "All my life," she said, "I thought he walked off because we weren't worth staying for." Duke lifted his head and with effort placed his muzzle on Grace's boot. Grace looked down at him. For the first time since they arrived, her face softened. She bent slowly and rested one hand on Duke's head. "Well," she whispered, voice breaking at the edge, "looks like somebody finally brought him home." Duke closed his eyes under her palm. For a while nobody moved. The old ranch kitchen held all of them in the quiet. Grace at the table with her father's voice still hanging in the air. Maggie beside the stove with her arms folded tight. Earl standing near the door, because standing near doors was what his body did when it did not know where danger would come from. Outside, the horses shifted in the paddock. A gate chain tapped softly against a post in the wind. Grace finally reached for the photograph. Her fingers touched the edge of it like it might vanish if handled too hard. "He watched all that?" she asked. Earl nodded. "Birthdays. Fairs. My wedding? There are notes. Pictures? Yes, ma'am." She gave a small, broken laugh. "All these years, I thought I was good at being alone." Maggie looked down. Earl knew that sentence. Not the words exactly, but the shape of it. The way people built a shelter out of what hurt and then called it character, because that sounded stronger. A vehicle came up the drive. Duke's eyes opened. Earl turned before the sound reached the window. A black SUV rolled past the cottonwoods and stopped near the porch. Maggie whispered, "No." Grace stood, the baby photograph still in her hand. "Who is that?" "Clayton Pierce," Earl said. The name meant nothing to her, but the way Earl said it made her set the photograph down. Pierce stepped out into the wind wearing the same charcoal overcoat, his shoes polished, his face calm beneath the wide Wyoming sky. He looked toward the kitchen window and raised one hand, not quite a wave. A man greeting people at a property he had already measured. Earl moved first. He stepped onto the porch before Pierce reached the stairs. Duke tried to follow, but Maggie caught his collar gently. "No, hero," she murmured. "You stay." Duke did not like it. Grace came to the doorway behind Earl. The shotgun was still leaning inside by the jamb, within reach. Pierce stopped at the bottom step. "Mrs. Holloway." Grace's eyes narrowed. "You know my name. I make it my business to know names when history is involved. Earl said nothing. Pierce looked at him. Mr. Whitman, I was hoping we could speak privately. No. The word sat cold between them. Pierce's smile did not move. Then plainly, the materials in your possession are about to become very complicated. Mrs. Holloway may have an emotional claim. You may have a physical claim. The storage company may assert procedural claim. If military agencies decide there is sensitive operational content, the entire archive may disappear into review for years. Grace stepped onto the porch. And you can prevent that? I can resolve it. Pierce turned toward her with practiced warmth. I have attorneys, archivists, private conservation space. I can protect your father's work and compensate everyone fairly. My father, Grace said, and the word still sounded new in her mouth. Pierce heard it. His eyes flickered. He reached into his coat and removed a folded document. $750,000, payable immediately upon transfer of the physical archive and associated materials. The wind moved under the porch roof. Earl looked at the paper. $750,000. The number did not hit like the first offer. It sank instead, heavy and silent. It became Duke's vet bills, Maggie's broken door, a winter roof, a truck that could cross a county line without praying, a bank account that would let a man stop waking up to arithmetic. Pierce held the paper toward him. You have done more than most men would have, Pierce said. You brought Mrs. Holloway the truth. No one can take that from you. But you do not owe the dead your life. Earl's hand stayed at his side. Pierce lowered his voice. And forgive me for saying this, but you are not in a position to fight a war with men who fight on paper. Grace looked at Earl then, not with suspicion, with understanding, which was worse, because she knew he needed it. Earl could feel every worn thing he owned pressing in on him. The patched coat, the empty tobacco tin, the pickup dying under Idaho snow, the dog behind him breathing carefully through bruised ribs because Earl had brought danger to his side again. Pierce stepped closer, keeping his hands visible. Mrs. Holloway has lived almost 70 years without this archive. The truth has been spoken. Let me carry the burden from here, Duke growled from inside the doorway. A low, cracked sound. Pierce glanced past Earl. That dog is going to need care. Earl's jaw tightened. There's no shame in accepting a way out, Pierce said. For 1 second, Earl saw it. Not as a dream, as logistics. Sign the paper. Put Duke in a real clinic. Pay Maggie back. Buy a room outside town with clean sheets and locks that worked. Let Pierce take the cans and tapes and letters into whatever polished rooms men like him owned. Let history become somebody else's problem. The porch boards creaked under Earl's boots. He said, I'll think on it. Grace looked at him sharply. Pierce did not smile, but satisfaction moved behind his eyes. Of course. He handed Earl a card with a private number written on the back. Then he returned to the SUV, leaving the paper folded on the porch rail, as if he already knew nobody would throw it away this time. When the vehicle vanished down the drive, Grace picked up the offer. Her hand did not shake. You thinking about taking it? Earl looked toward the hills. I'd be a fool not to think. Grace nodded once, and a coward not to finish thinking. There was no anger in it. That made it cut deeper. That night, they did not leave. Snow began again after sunset, soft at first, then thick enough to erase the fence line. Grace gave Maggie the guest room. Earl refused the couch and took a blanket near the back door. Duke lay against him, ribs bandaged, refusing every soft bed offered. Near midnight, the wind hit the barn. The loose tin roof cracked once. White light flashed behind Earl's eyes. Not lightning. Flare. He was on the road again. Dust boiling through headlights. Ruiz in the lead truck. Radio static chopping the air. Someone yelling for a medic. A young soldier calling for his mother in a voice too small for his body. Earl came up moving. Blanket gone. Knife in his hand. Bare feet on cold floorboards. The kitchen was dark, but he was no longer in the kitchen. The barn roof banged again. He crossed the mudroom, opened the back door, and stepped into the snow. Wind slapped his face. He did not feel it. His eyes searched for muzzle flashes that were not there. Fence posts became silhouettes. The horse trough became a burned engine block. The cottonwoods became men standing too still. "Contact left," he whispered. Duke came after him, limping. Maggie called from somewhere inside, but her voice could not reach the place he had gone. Earl moved across the yard with the knife low, shoulders hunched against a desert that existed only inside him. His breath came hard. Snow gathered in his beard. Then something caught his sleeve. Duke. The dog had dragged himself through the snow and taken Earl's coat cuff gently in his teeth, not pulling hard. Just enough. Earl turned. Duke stood on 3 legs, trembling from pain and cold, still holding on. The knife slipped from Earl's hand and dropped into the snow. The sound was small. Enough. Earl looked down at his bare feet, white in the snow. The barn, the ranch house, the Wyoming night. Duke's teeth on his sleeve. He sank to one knee. Duke released the fabric and pressed his head into Earl's chest. Earl's hand closed in the dog's fur. "Here," he said, voice breaking into the wind. "Wyoming. Snow, no contact." The back porch light came on. Grace stood in the doorway with a coat over her nightgown. Maggie stood beside her, one hand over her mouth. Neither spoke. Earl stayed in the snow with Duke until his breathing slowed. Then he looked at the ranch house, the barn, the folded offer still lying on the kitchen table behind him, and the wounded dog who had followed him into the cold because staying was the only order Duke had never needed to be taught. By morning, the paper from Clayton Pierce was gone. In its place on Grace's table sat Holloway's final cassette tape. Earl had written one word on the envelope. Barn. Grace saw it at breakfast and did not ask why right away. She stood at the kitchen counter in a heavy sweater, pouring coffee into 3 mismatched mugs while the morning light came thin and gray through the window. Outside, snow had softened the ranch yard into a blank white sheet except for the tracks Earl and Duke had left in the night. One set of boot prints, one set of paw prints, uneven, stubborn, leading out into darkness and back again. Duke lay near the stove, bandaged ribs rising slow, eyes half open. Grace set a mug in front of Earl. "You remembered something." Earl looked at the envelope beside the tape player. "Not remembered," he said. "Placed it." Maggie leaned against the sink. "Placed what?" Earl took the cassette from the envelope. Holloway had labeled it in black ink. Final log. Open where I began. On the back, in smaller writing, was a line Earl had missed before. Caroline's barn. Wind River. Grace's face went still. "My mother's barn," she said. Earl looked toward the window. The red barn stood beyond the paddock, its roof patched with sheet metal, its doors hanging on old iron rollers. He recorded it for there. Grace's mouth tightened. "That barn's been standing since before I was born." "Then that's where we play it." She stared at the cassette for a long moment. When she turned away, she carried her coffee but did not drink it. By mid-morning, the wind had cleared enough for them to cross the yard. Maggie carried the tape player wrapped in a towel under her coat. Earl carried the cassette and Holloway's field notebook. Grace carried the baby photograph, folded once inside her shirt pocket like something too private for a frame. Duke followed despite everyone telling him not to. He moved slowly, one careful step at a time, head low against the wind. Halfway across the yard, Earl stopped. Duke. The dog stopped too. Truck. Duke looked toward the barn, then back at Earl. Truck, Earl repeated. Duke stood in the snow for 3 seconds, thinking it over like an old sergeant deciding whether an order was worth respecting. Then he turned and limped to the farm truck parked beside the barn. Earl opened the passenger door, and Duke climbed in with help, settling where he could see them all. Grace watched that, something soft passing over her face. He argues like my first husband. Did your first husband ever win? Not often. The barn doors groaned open. Inside smelled of hay dust, old leather, cold wood, and motor oil. Light entered through gaps between the boards in thin, bright lines. Saddles hung on pegs. A rusted tractor sat beneath a tarp. Along the far wall, Grace had stacked hay bales under a loft ladder polished smooth by decades of hands. This was where Mama kept everything that didn't fit in the house, Grace said. Tools, tack, storm lanterns, secrets, apparently. Earl moved slowly through the space, not touching anything at first. He looked at the floorboards, the rafters, the old workbench near the back wall. His eye caught small things. A new scratch on old wood. A nail driven at a different angle. A patch in the wall boards behind the workbench. Duke whined from the truck. Earl turned. The dog was staring through the open barn door, ears forward, gaze fixed on the back wall. Earl followed the line of sight. There, above the workbench, hung a faded piece of canvas. Grace pulled it aside. Behind it, carved into one plank in small block letters, were 2 initials. R.H. Grace touched them. Her hand came away dusty. He was here. Maggie set the tape player on the workbench. No one spoke while she plugged it into a long orange extension cord. The little machine clicked when she pressed play. Static. A long breath. Then Robert Holloway's voice. Older than the man in the reels, older even than the father on the other tapes. If this is playing in Caroline's barn, then someone finally found Grace, or Grace found the nerve to let a dead man speak. Either way, I'll take it. Grace closed her eyes. The tape hissed. I began here, not in uniform, not in a desert. Here. I was 19 when Caroline told me she was pregnant. Her father said I'd ruined her. Mine said I'd ruined myself. The army recruiter said a uniform could make a man out of me. I believed all 3 men because I was young and stupid and scared. Earl looked down at Holloway's notebook. The voice continued. I signed papers I did not understand. I left before I learned how to stay. That was my first failure. Grace's jaw worked once. But this tape is not only for my daughter. It is for every family named in the reels. LZ Sparrow was not an accident of fog, dust, and bad luck. The civilians were reported. The convoy was redirected anyway. When it went wrong, they needed one clean story and several dirty scapegoats. Men under my command were blamed for confusion they did not create. Some died with their names bent crooked in the report. Some came home carrying blame that belonged above them. Earl's hand tightened around the notebook. Maggie's eyes lifted. Holloway's voice hardened. I copied the radio logs. I filmed the civilian movement before the convoy came in. I recorded the order relayed through Captain Elwood at 14:30 hours. You will hear them on Reel 9 and Cassette 6. They prove advance notice went up the chain. They prove Sergeant Daniel Ruiz called the hazard twice before impact. The barn seemed to drop away beneath Earl. Ruiz. Not a ghost this time. A name spoken by the dead with the weight of fact. Earl stepped back once, but the workbench caught him at the hip. The tape kept going. Ruiz pulled 2 men from the first vehicle before the second blast. Official record says he broke formation and contributed to the confusion. That is false. He held the line longer than any man had a right to. If anyone hears this who knew him, tell them he did his job. Earl's breathing changed. He saw Ruiz again. Not in the flashback's broken way. Clearer, younger, laughing, swearing at a jammed radio, throwing Earl into a ditch so hard his ribs cracked, then turning back toward smoke. Earl had lived. Ruiz had not. For 20 years, the report had said Ruiz made a mistake. Earl had read that line until the ink lived under his skin. Grace turned toward him. "You knew him." Earl nodded, but the motion barely moved. The tape hissed. "I kept the evidence because truth has a way of outliving men if someone gives it a dry box and enough time. To Grace, I leave my name if she wants it. To the families, I leave the proof. To whoever found this trunk, I leave the burden I was not brave enough to carry into daylight." The voice weakened. "One more thing. There are men who profited from the silence. Some still have friends. If a collector named Pierce comes smiling, remember this. He tried once before to buy what I buried. I told him no. He knows what is in here. He has always known." Maggie whispered, "Clayton." The tape clicked on. "Do not sell him my dead." Then silence. The machine stopped. No one moved. From the truck, Duke gave a low, tired bark. Outside, wind pushed snow across the barn door. Earl looked down at the envelope, at the initials carved into the wall, at Grace standing under the same beams where her parents had once been young and frightened. Then he opened Holloway's notebook to the page marked Reel 9. Inside the folded map was a list of names: families, soldiers, witnesses, and halfway down, written in Holloway's steady hand, Sergeant Daniel Ruiz, saved Whitman, E. Confirm through survivor testimony if alive. Earl touched the line with one finger. Grace stood beside him. "That's you." Earl did not answer. His throat had closed around something too old to name. Maggie picked up the tape player, but her hands were shaking now. "This changes everything," she said. Earl looked toward the truck where Duke watched him through the open door, hurt and faithful and still on guard. "No," Earl said quietly. "It puts everything back where it was supposed to be." It did not happen quickly. Truth never moved as fast as money. Money had engines, lawyers, clean shoes, and men like Clayton Pierce who could cross 3 states before breakfast. Truth moved in boxes, sworn statements, old film cans, careful hands, and people who had been disappointed too many times to trust the first good news. Grace was confirmed as Robert Holloway's legal heir 6 weeks later. The lawyer who handled it was a soft-spoken woman from Cheyenne with gray eyes and a habit of removing her glasses before saying anything important. She reviewed the birth certificate, the letters, Holloway's service record, the taped statements, and the chain of possession from Silver Pine storage to Earl to Grace. When she finished, she looked across Grace's kitchen table and said, "Mrs. Holloway, the physical archive and associated personal materials are yours." Grace sat still. Earl stood near the back door with Duke beside him, both of them watching the yard more than the lawyer. Duke's bandage was gone by then, though he still moved carefully in the mornings. A thin line of white fur had grown where the bruising had been worst. Maggie sat with both hands wrapped around a mug. The lawyer continued. "The historical and media rights will take more work, but Captain Holloway clearly intended these materials to be preserved, not sold privately." "Good," Grace said. The lawyer blinked. "You understand their value?" "I understand enough. There may be private offers in the millions." Grace looked toward Earl, then toward Duke, then down at the baby photograph lying beside her father's final tape. "All my life I thought the man didn't want me," she said. "I'm not selling the proof that he did." That was the first door closing. Others followed. The storage company sent one letter, then stopped after Maggie's museum friend asked whether they truly wanted their name attached to a lawsuit against a homeless veteran, a wounded service dog, and a woman reclaiming her dead father's personal letters. Clayton Pierce called twice. Grace did not answer. On the third call, Earl picked up. Pierce was silent for one beat too long. "Mr. Whitman," he said, "I assume Mrs. Holloway is unavailable." "She is. I hope she understands I can still help." Earl looked out the window. Grace was in the barn, standing beneath the carved initials with one hand on the old plank. Duke sat beside her, nose lifted to the winter air. "You can help by staying gone," Earl said. Pierce gave a small sigh. "You think this is justice?" "No." "What is it then?" Earl watched Duke lean gently against Grace's leg. "Recovery." He hung up. The archive went to the Mountain States Veterans Museum under an agreement Grace wrote by hand before the lawyers made it neat. Maggie oversaw the film restoration. Earl gave testimony about Sergeant Daniel Ruiz, though the first time he sat under fluorescent lights with a recorder on the table. His hand shook so hard, Duke climbed halfway into his lap and ruined everyone's professional posture. Nobody complained. Reel 9 changed things. Not all at once, not cleanly, but enough. The false report on LZ Sparrow was reopened. Families received letters they had waited 20 years to read. Sergeant Daniel Ruiz's record was corrected. His sister flew in from Arizona and stood beside Earl in a small museum room while Holloway's footage played on a screen. Ruiz pulling one man from smoke, then turning back for another. Earl did not cry. He stood very straight. Duke sat against his leg. When the screen went dark, Ruiz's sister took Earl's scarred hand in both of hers. "He saved you?" she asked. Earl nodded. "He saved a lot of us." She looked at the empty screen. "Then I'm glad somebody finally saved him." That night, Earl slept 6 hours, not peacefully, not without waking. But when the wind hit the windows after midnight, Duke lifted his head, and Earl reached down to touch the dog's ear. "Wyoming," he whispered. Duke sighed and went back to sleep. Spring came late to Wind River County. Snow melted out of the ditches and left the roads soft. Grass appeared first in thin green threads near the barn. The horses shed winter hair in clumps along the fence rails. Grace opened the windows of the ranch house and let the cold, clean air move through rooms that had held too much silence for too many years. By June, the first exhibition opened, not in some marble hall back east. Grace insisted it start in Wyoming. The museum hung Holloway's photographs and film stills on plain white walls. Medics under canvas, civilians at LZ Sparrow, soldiers writing letters in dust, children wrapped in blankets, Ruiz running through smoke. In one quiet corner behind glass lay the baby photograph of Grace Ann Holloway and the tape marked Final Log. People came. Veterans came first, standing with caps in their hands, reading every caption. Widows came. Sons and daughters came. Men who had not spoken of Iraq in 20 years stood in front of the footage and suddenly began telling the person beside them where they had been, what they had heard, who had not come home. Earl watched from near the exit. Always near the exit. Maggie found him there halfway through the opening night. "You know," she said, "most people stand by the thing they helped make. I can see better from here." "Liar." He almost smiled. Across the room, Grace stood before a photograph of her father as a young captain. Not the hidden man, not the distant man at county fairs and roadsides. A man caught mid-turn, dust on his face, one hand raised toward whoever was holding the camera. Grace lifted her hand slightly, not touching the glass. Duke walked to her and sat. The whole room seemed to soften around that one small thing. The money came later. Licensing, exhibitions. Documentary rights Grace approved only after reading every line. Donations from people who had seen the show and written letters with checks folded inside. A national veterans group partnered with the museum. A foundation offered matching funds. Grace named it the Holloway Duke Fund. Earl refused the name at first. Duke did not object, so Earl lost. The fund did exactly what Grace said it should do. Temporary rooms in motels that allowed dogs, help with VA paperwork, transportation to clinics, dog food, winter coats, phone cards, first month's rent when possible, no speeches, no pity dressed up as charity, just a door held open long enough for someone tired to step through. Grace asked Earl to run the outreach. He said no. She waited. He said no again. Maggie brought coffee. Duke put his head on Earl's knee. Earl looked at the three of them and said something under his breath that made Grace smile. By the end of the week, he had an office in the old tack room of the barn. 1 desk, 2 chairs, a coffee pot, a cot nobody talked about, Duke's bed in the corner. On the wall, Maggie hung a framed still from Holloway's film, Ruiz carrying a wounded man through smoke. Earl left it there. One cold evening in October, almost a year after the raffle, Earl drove an old white ranch truck toward the Idaho line with Duke riding shotgun. Duke's muzzle had gone grayer. Earl's beard had been trimmed by Grace, badly, and he had not complained because some arguments were not worth entering. They stopped at a gas station outside a logging town, just as the sun slid behind the hills. A man sat beside the ice machine with a duffel bag at his feet. Older, army field jacket, hands tucked under his arms for warmth. People passed him on their way inside and back out again, stepping around him the way people stepped around things they had decided not to see. Earl watched for a moment through the windshield. Duke stood on the seat, ears forward. "I see him," Earl said. He bought 2 coffees and a plain biscuit. Then he walked over and set 1 coffee beside the man. The man looked up fast, suspicious. Earl did not stand over him. He lowered himself onto the curb, slow, leaving space between them. Duke came around and sat near the man's duffel without being asked. The man stared at the dog first, then at Earl. "You selling something?" "No." "You church?" "No." "Then what?" Earl broke the biscuit in half and gave Duke the smaller piece, which Duke accepted with visible disappointment. Earl handed the other half to the man. The man looked at it like kindness might have a hook in it. Earl took a sip of coffee and looked out toward the dark line of trees beyond the pumps. "You got a dog-friendly place to sleep tonight?" The man did not answer, but his eyes moved to Duke. Duke leaned his shoulder lightly against the man's leg, old and steady, as if he had been waiting there the whole time. The man's hand came down slowly into Duke's fur. His fingers closed there. For a while, nobody said anything. Headlights passed. The gas pump clicked. Somewhere in the cold blue evening, a trucker laughed into a phone. Earl sat beside a stranger on a curb and felt the shape of the world change by 1 small inch. The archive had been worth millions. People said that all the time now. But Earl knew better. The fortune was not the film. It was not the foundation. It was not the checks or the museum walls or the corrected records. The fortune was this: a man nobody saw, a dog who refused to look away, and 1 more door opening before the night got too cold. And maybe that's the real question this story leaves behind. If you believe loyalty like Duke's still exists in this world, leave a simple one in the comments. If you believe everyone deserves someone who refuses to give up on them, leave a 0. I read as many comments as I can, and I'd love to know where you stand. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more powerful stories waiting just around the next corner. Stories about courage, second chances, forgotten heroes, and the loyal dogs who stand beside them when nobody else does. Until the next story, take care of yourself, and never underestimate the life-changing power of being the one person who chooses to stay.